That same day, the sun rose, and the results of the competition were published in the skyscraper of the city. All the people who were walking in the area took out their mobiles because the news was going very viral. This news was none other than Lu Sheng being the champion. His victory had been mentioned very briefly in the report on the great competition of the Eastern Military District. However, Lu Sheng had already become famous throughout the Dragon Military Division. At that same time, Lu Sheng was staying in a luxurious hotel in the city. He was sitting down, and while he had one hand resting on the arm of the chair, he took out his mobile with the other and started browsing online. While he was absorbed in his mobile phone, his butler, who was holding 2 black boxes, appeared and informed him that the weapon he wanted to improve was ready, asking him to please take a look. Upon hearing the voice of the butler, Lu Sheng came out of his trance, picked up one of the black boxes, and upon opening it, it began to emit a brilliant light. He started to observe it and his eyes filled with emotion and he couldn't help but smile. According to him, this weapon was not bad at all, since it was made with more than 90% mithril and also it had some rare materials that were not inferior to mithril. Now this weapon had reached level 8. The butler placed his hand on his abdomen, closed his eyes, and slightly bowed his head before him as a form of respect, and mentioned that the great military tournament was going to start soon, and the marshal had suggested that Lu Sheng depart in these days since the army could provide a private plane. Lu Sheng put the weapon in the suitcase, and while he was holding it with one hand, he turned his back to the butler, closed his eyes, and with a smile began to say goodbye to him with his hand, and told him that it was not necessary since he wanted to go home once before the military tournament. As long as he arrived 1 or 2 days early, it was fine. After saying this, Lu Sheng began to head towards the door. The butler bowed his head before him, said goodbye, and decided not to bother him anymore. At that moment, a maid appeared and started staring at Lu Sheng. He approached the door, placed his hand on the doorknob, and just when he was about to open it, someone asked him to wait. Upon hearing the voice, with a calm look, Lu Sheng began to observe the doorknob and remained thinking in silence. He turned his head back and saw maid Lai Dai. She placed her hand on her chest and started to show a nervous smile. She knew that he was going to the great competition of the Central Military District, so she wanted to accompany him to serve him and make sure that he lacked nothing. Lu Sheng did not take long to realize that she had already begun to act. He started looking at her with an indifferent gaze and accepted without much thought. A wicked smile appeared on Lai Dai's face. She placed her hand over her chest, bowed her head before him, began to look down with a malicious gaze, and thanked him. Judging by her reaction, Lu Sheng's suspicions were confirmed and he couldn't help but smile, saying that there was no need to thank him since after all she was at his service. He closed his eyes and began to show a kind smile to Lai Dai, and started pretending that he should be the one who should be grateful for having such a loyal maid like her. Upon hearing this, Lai Dai, who had her hands on her abdomen, opened her eyes and began to sweat. Her gaze showed that she knew Lu Sheng was aware of what she was planning to do. Lu Sheng, who with one hand was holding the suitcase where he carried the weapon, opened the door, put the other inside his pants pocket, left the room, and with a serene look asked her to get ready since they were going to leave soon. Lai Dai lowered her head before him, started looking at the ground with a lost expression, and responded with an understood. That same day, once night fell, Lu Sheng and Snowy, who had gone out for a romantic walk in the park, held hands and started walking across the bridge. He was going to go home before the military tournament began, so he asked her if she wanted to come with him. With a sad look, she started looking down at the ground. This time she couldn't go with him since he had interrupted her brother's martial path, and everyone in her house knew about this, and by obligation she had to return. Lu Sheng began to observe her and stayed listening in silence without interrupting, questioning whether it really had been a good idea to interrupt Dong Shengyi's martial path. He took Snowy's hand, stood in front of her, started looking into her eyes with a loving gaze, and asked if she wanted him to accompany her back. Since now that Dong Shengyi was like this, his ambition remained extremely high, and the path he had chosen, the way to seek holiness, was an invincible path. She began to observe him and mentioned that Dong Shengyi should also think that his talent and abilities were not up to this path. He took her hand with both hands. Even if Dong Shengyi had not encountered Lu Sheng, sooner or later he would run into someone stronger, and at that moment, perhaps he would not only lose his pride but also his life. Now that he had interrupted his path, if he could find another way out and rise again after adversity, maybe he would have opportunities for change. She started to look at the ground and fell silent. With a sad look, she explained that although she did not understand very well what he was saying, she was going to take care of conveying this message to Dong Potion just as it was. Lu Sheng put his hand behind his head, closed his eyes, and began to show a forced smile. In this military competition, it was very likely that he would encounter her brother, Dong Potion, so he asked her to inform her brother in advance since he did not want to see him end up like Dong Sheni, depressed after the defeat. Upon hearing this, she moved her hand away and with a surprised look remembered that her older brother was also going to participate in the military competition. She started to look down and decided to tell her older brother something later. Then, she launched herself at Lu Sheng and gave him a hug. Having him so close made her start to blush like a tomato. Lu Sheng hugged her and began to smile, and he couldn't help but feel an inner peace since this was what he had been wanting for a long time. She firmly believed that with Lu Sheng's strength, perhaps their love could really be possible. The next day, Lu Sheng went to the high-speed train in the city, which could move quickly between cities. He sat down, crossed his arms, and with a smile began to observe the outside through the window. While he was distracted contemplating the views, 2 train attendants appeared. One carried a tray with a glass and juice. She put her hand near her mouth and with a cheerful smile asked our commander if he needed help with anything. Upon hearing the voice of the train attendant, Lu Sheng came out of his trance, turned towards them, closed his eyes, began to wave with his hand and with a kind smile told them that he did not need anything, thanking them for asking. They left and Lu Sheng, who had both hands resting on the arms of the chair, began to look outside through the window again. The train attendants turned around the corner and started talking among themselves. They were in love with Lu Sheng. The customer they had received this time was very handsome. He was very young, just like a young commander taken from a manga. At that moment, another girl joined the conversation saying that the true elite handsome ones were in the army. According to them, handsome men should be soldiers who protected the country since ugly ones were celebrities who did nothing. They knew that Lu Sheng had a high status and identity, as this train line had been opened especially for him. While they were conversing, someone wearing a black skirt appeared and judging by her appearance, I guess she is Lai Dai. She went over to where our boy was. He was in the luxurious carriage of the train. On the table next to him there was a cup of tea. With a calm look he asked Lai Dai to serve a new cup since the tea had cooled down. Lai Dai placed her hands over her abdomen, bowed her head before him and responded with an understanding. She went to the tea room, put the teacup under the machine, pressed the button with her hand and slowly the cup began to fill up. Several seconds later, the teacup was full and she added something to the tea. She grabbed the cup with both hands, started to observe it with an evil look and couldn't help but smile. Lai Dai returned again to the carriage where Lu Sheng was, approached him and informed him that the tea was ready. Lu Sheng, who was browsing on his mobile, asked her to leave the cup on the table since he was currently sending messages. Lai Dai obeyed and left the cup of tea on the table. Lu Sheng, who was holding the mobile with one hand, began to browse through it with the other and with a serene look remembered He Ling Su and Chen Jia. He decided it was time to go help a little. His expression changed to disappointment as king he had not yet reached level 4. He did not know how someone with that level of strength could sleep. He needed to increase training 5 times, and that is how he decided this pleasantly. Lu Sheng continued browsing his phone for several minutes, and at that moment, Lai Dai appeared, bowed her head before him, and mentioned that the tea was going to get cold. Upon hearing her voice, Lu Sheng stopped browsing on his mobile, started to look at her and with a smile asked why she was pressing so much for him to drink the tea. Lai Dai raised her head and her eyes filled with surprise, and she couldn't help but start sweating. She explained that Lu Sheng had just said he wanted hot tea. She didn't want this cup to cool down either, and if he was thirsty now, then he couldn't drink immediately. Upon hearing this, Lu Sheng picked up the cup of tea before it cooled down, and without hesitating for a second, brought it to his mouth and took a sip. Lai Dai began to stare at him and fell silent. After taking a sip, Lu Sheng moved the teacup away from his mouth, closed his eyes and with a smile said that it was not bad. This tea was better prepared than ever. Lai Dai lowered her head in front of him, closed her eyes and said that she was glad that he liked this tea. She decided to go to the bathroom for a moment. After a few minutes, she crossed the bathroom door, closed it, leaned her back against it, put her hand on her chest, and couldn't help but feel relieved. Several seconds later, she opened her eyes, which were filled with emotion as she had completed her task. The cup of tea contained level 9 beast gene poison. Not even the most powerful of the great clans could withstand it for more than a minute. Although it could not kill a level 9 holy martial artist, it could leave him seriously injured and with an incurable wound for life, as it affected several parts of the body. She clenched her fist tightly, began to extend her hand towards the door, and with an excited look, she started to smile. She just needed one more minute, and once she got out of here, then she could be completely free, freeing herself from the control of the army and getting rid of this humble and oppressive life. She placed her hand on her chest and began to bring the other closer to the bathroom doorknob. Her eyes filled with joy and she couldn't help but smile. She was going to go to a new place to start a new life. She grabbed the doorknob and at that moment, it began to emit a strange energy. Upon feeling this energy, Li-Dai quickly pulled her hand away from the knob, started looking at her hand with a terrified expression and couldn't help but wonder what was happening. The strange energy gradually began to enter her hand, causing her to fall to her knees on the ground. She placed her hand over her arm, and upon seeing this energy, her eyes filled with fear, and she couldn't help but start sweating as she didn't know what was happening. Now her hand was very hot. Lu Sheng appeared and with a smile revealed that this was called mental illusion. The reality was that the maid was not in the bathroom. She remained in the same carriage as him. She was on her knees on the floor, and Lu Sheng was pouring hot tea onto her hand. She clenched her fist, and while she was writhing in pain, with a serene look, he revealed that he had learned this little trick recently. Li-Dai came out of the mental illusion, and upon seeing Lu Sheng, her eyes filled with terror, causing her to start sweating. Without a doubt for a second, she knelt before him. Lu Sheng had reached the divine level in martial arts, and today Li-Dai had witnessed it. Lu Sheng took out a green jar, threw it into the air, and with a smile explained that he too had expanded his knowledge today. He did not expect that after 300 years of martial arts there was a poison capable of killing a holy warrior. He took the jar with his hand and mentioned that the wound of the saint, the name of this ointment, was quite good. While he had one hand in his pocket, he began to observe the jar with a calm look and asked her what she thought about it. Li-Dai, who was kneeling before him, remained silent. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.